over 70% of world trade takes place within a rules-based structure. In other words, the United States is not the only country that dictates how trade happens. Politics is now much more about insulting people. It's much more about attacking people. It's much more about slogans and bumper stickers. If you don't create the space in your life for optimism, you get overwhelmed by pessimism. We'd be making a big mistake if we didn't learn from the success of countries like Ukraine and others that have looked to how we apply our skill set. For example, we have some capacity in AI, we have some capacity in cyber, and that's what our military is being asked to do by the Prime Minister.
Given the necessity of actually having serious political discussions again at the national level amongst the public, how do we foster that type of engagement if we had it at all in the past? It was the Greeks that coined the phrase, "the only constant is change," and rarely has that sentiment felt truer for Canada and the West these days. After World War II, Canada emerged with an industrial base that was envied by the world, with a clear sense that its interests lay in cooperation, building alliances, mediating disputes, and championing really what was the US-led rules-based order. But today, that order is shifting. The United States is turning inward and is pursuing a more unilateral approach to security and to power. And so where does that leave Canada? What responsibilities can we assume? What risks might we face? And how do we recalibrate really to maintain our influence, our values, our credibility in a more multipolar, uncertain world? Well, these are all really great questions for today's guest, Bob Rae, Canada's outgoing ambassador to the United Nations. Mr. Ambassador, I must confess, I start today's discussion really in a bit of a quandary. Specifically, I'm actually not sure how to address you because over the course of my lifetime, you've played many significant, prominent roles in my life, including as my premier, my MP, my university professor, and now my ambassador to the United Nations. And so while I will refer to you as Ambassador Rae throughout this interview, I want my listeners to be aware that your reach, your impact on people of my generation and political lifetime is really profound. It's multifaceted. And so I say with deference to your entire political career, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining the Brave New Something podcast. And remember, this time there are no report cards at the end of the session. So just keep that in mind.
Don't worry about it. This is all good. I'm delighted to be with you, Mark, and very happy to be chatting with you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Ambassador, first off, before I even ask you any questions, simply to ensure I'm not putting words in your mouth, did you agree with my synopsis of the changes to the world system that are taking place as I laid them out?
Yes, but it's not just the changes in the United States. It's a mistake to think that only what is happening in the U.S. is causing a change in what's happening in the world. You have China, you have Russia, you have a number of other countries that are rapidly growing, rapidly expressing their concern at not being able to play a stronger role in the world. So I would say that it's the discombobulation of the world is multipolar. It's all over the place. It is a time of great change and evolving change, and that's what makes it so fascinating, but also makes it hard to be certain about what what the next steps for Canada should be. Although I think I have some pretty strong recommendations that I've been making to the government, and I think Mr. Carney has some pretty strong ideas as well, which I think are constructive. And so the big risk is doing nothing is an even bigger risk than doing something. So I would say it certainly is a time of change.
Well, good news, sir. You've granted me 45 minutes, and the questions that I intend to ask you deal with that multifaceted change that is taking place and is not purely from a U.S. perspective. So let me start with a question exactly in line with that very point. I usually begin my interviews with like an over-the-plate easy question to get rolling, but today instead I'm going to start with what's perhaps the critical question to answer before really any other can be addressed. And that question really has to do with realpolitik and the shifting power in the current international political system. From a global perspective, just so that I understand your mental framework and can ask questions in that regard, as we enter into the second half of 2025, Is the global international political framework an American-led one, a multipolar one, a Chinese one? And more importantly, if you were to imagine yourself answering that question in 4 years' time, do you anticipate having a bit of a different answer to that?
Well, first of all, Mark, let's try to keep it as simple as we can. Politics, whether it's local, national, or international, uh, is always about two principal things. The first is the exercise of power, and the second is the world of values, ethics, morals, the things that we base our personal lives on, the things we base our public lives on. And it's important to understand that the world has always been about this. And sometimes people clothe um, their power with a ton of values, and sometimes people exercise their power without much consideration as to the values behind them. Some people have a very transactional view of things. Um, and then there is the other reality of life, which is that in every context, there are always bad people who are seeking more power and have no ethical framework in which that power should be exercised, which is what totalitarianism is all about. Not a new phenomenon, but it's certainly the key phenomenon of the 20th century. And the technology is now available, which allows highly centralized organizations, whether they're countries or criminal enterprises or anything else, to exercise their power in a whole variety of ways over media, through the use of technology, through a whole bunch of different ways. So the world we're in now is definitely very messy. It's I think for many of us, I think we've come away from a time when um, we thought we could count on certain things. We thought the world would work in a certain way, but I think we're increasingly understanding that we can count on less, and the path forward is less certain and secure than we used to think it was.
Yes, and I think I, along with everyone who follows global politics, are seeing that avidly play out both on a global stage and within certain countries, as you mentioned, more than one in this world. One of the bulwarks against authoritarianism, to my mind, especially after World War II, is of course cooperation, and to some degree, middle powers have always fostered that, specifically because I guess, our power increases as we have more people who collectively agree and are ready to take a singular approach. And to that end, I really want to turn our attention to Canada and the role that we're playing in the world as almost a bulwark against some of these movements that you've mentioned. I think one of the more interesting facets of today's global political system is that if Canada is a middle power, so are a lot of other countries. The countries of Europe, Australia, Vietnam, Brazil, the list goes on. And these countries, broadly speaking, recognize that global stability, the contrary aspect of what it is you've just brought up, suits their own ambitions. And they're heavily invested, therefore, in maintaining global order that values trading stability and, above all, a rule of law based order where individuals, companies can facilitate economic, social engagements across large sections of the globe. My question comes down to the intertwining of middle powers. Because if there is to be a bulwark against authoritarianism and wayward state actors, I believe it is found within that middle power. If Canada's goals are the same as other middle powers, is there a power in those numbers that allow Canada to craft an alternative to the great power system? A network of interests that can hold its own, if you will, against the individual dictates of an authoritarian China, a rogue US, or any of the lone acting hegemons?
I think the short answer to your question is up to a point. An interesting statistic that not a lot of people talk about is the World Trade Organization tells us that as of today, over 70% of world trade takes place within a rules-based structure. In other words, United States is not the only country that dictates how trade happens. And I think it's important for us, therefore, to put that in some perspective. Um, but the other up to a point is that the way in which power is exercised often depends on the use of force, and it really depends on the capacity of middle powers to take their own self-defense and self-interest, to take it seriously, and secondly, to keep on pointing out, by the benefit of the power of our example, that in fact when we do work together successfully, we are able um, to provide more predictability, more security, more safety, more opportunity to more people. And I think you're seeing now in our foreign policy, we're reaching out very deliberately. The Prime Minister, you can watch him as he goes, right? I mean, he's going all over the place, and there are some people in Canada who say, well, why doesn't he just stay home? And the answer is because we can't afford to. We can't afford to take the ostrich approach to foreign policy. We have to be out there, working with other countries that believe, for sometimes for different reasons, but that believe in many of the things that we believe in. So the Scandinavians, the Europeans, many Latin American countries, many African countries, many Asian countries, with whom we have a whole variety of trading agreements, and other agreements, want us to be working together, want us to be working effectively. But there is a lot, as you describe it, there's a lot of rogue activity going on out there. Some of it being carried out by new kinds of rogue actors. You have more organized crime at the international level. You have people who make money from trafficking drugs, trafficking women, trafficking migrants, creating havoc, kidnapping and shooting people in order to expand their own power. One of our close friends, Mexico, has been wrestling with dealing with a large element of organized crime within their own country. And then you have other political leaders acting without regard to the concept of international law, without regard to the concept that there are rules that are supposed to apply to all of us. And so, does that affect the ability of middle powers to, you know, make their way and get their way in the world? Of course it does, but it doesn't eliminate it entirely. And it also, I think, reinforces those of us who believe very strongly that Canada's international engagement is not a game. It's not an exercise in nostalgia. It's not about trying to get back to a wonderful world we once had. It's a very tough-minded assessment of what we need to do to be able to make our way in the world more effectively as a matter of interest, and also how we can do it in a way that's follows certain key moral principles, and principles that point out that we're not only interested in ourselves, we're interested in what happens to other people, and in good measure, because what happens to other people also helps us in the world. So it can become a more benign circle if we work at it.
Yes. Well, you make some really good points there, and you started the beginning of that answer talking
Thank you.
about uh, talking about the use of force and the fact that we're entering into a bit of a militarized world. And then, of course, the problems that middle powers experience, which probably is directly connected to that in a realpolitik world where force has greater efficacy than probably ever before since World War II. Maybe I can turn my attention. I wasn't planning on going to this area yet, but maybe I can turn my attention to Canada as a military force for a second. Like many of our Canada, like many of its European contemporaries, really as a peacetime dividend has allowed its military to wane. And that era is seemingly coming to an end, and a new story is, I think, starting to unfold. And it's a story that's significantly different from the one that many saw coming when Trump kind of encouraged greater global investments in defense, as he's been doing for years. Um, Watching Ukraine's remarkable resilience against a much larger aggressor has challenged many of the assumptions of what military strength actually even means, right? I mean, Ukraine has shown that logistics, mobilization capacity, distributed technology. These can sometimes matter more than billion-dollar aircraft programs. And Canada, which has traditionally kind of relied on high cost procurement, the F-35 and others, might our basically our scale, our geography, and above all, our military starting point may argue for a different kind of investment. And so, from your vantage point at the UN, do you see a path for Canada and middle powers to punch above their weight by focusing less on prestige platforms and more on scalable logistics, cyber defense, drone networks, rapid response supply infrastructure? Could a shift towards those capacities redefine how middle powers like Canada contribute meaningfully to global security and thus play an ever larger role in a multipolar and a rougher world?
You ask very long questions, Mark, and mainly you also do something which I've gotten used to in the business of dealing with journalists and reporters over many, many years. The answer is contained in your question, and the answer is yes.
The answer is yes.
Yes, we'd be making a big mistake if we didn't learn from the success of countries like Ukraine and others that have looked to how we apply our skill set. For example, we have some capacity in AI, we have some capacity in cyber, and that's what our military is being asked to do by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is asking the military to think through our strategy in such a way that we can, in fact, look at the broader experience of a number of different countries of different sizes in terms of where and how they want to spend their money and how they want to build up their strength. And that's partly a matter of technology and making decisions about what platforms you invest in. It's also a matter of focusing on recruitment and training and the skill sets that you need in your military. Should we be spending more on military? I think it's inevitable. I think it's also important for us to continue to assess on an ongoing basis to make sure that we don't go through huge swings of the pendulum, which we've gone through since the 1980s, basically, when governments, conservative and liberal, both decided that we didn't actually need to spend as much money on equipment, and we didn't need to spend that much money on people. And we ended up not doing so. And then we are now in a position where we're short of people and we're short of equipment. And that's not a good position to be in. And again, the government of Canada is trying to remedy that situation. And I think there will be, I hope it'll become more of a public debate and a public argument, because oftentimes in Canada, in our political culture, these issues are very much kept close to the chest. But I'm a big believer in expanding the scope of debate and discussion about, well, what technology should we have, and how do we take advantage of our skill set that we do have, and what do we do about the recruitment problem? Because we do have a recruitment issue right now in the military.
You mentioned that these problems are things that to some degree go under the public radar. So advise us, because you're obviously actively connected with the existing government. You have close connections with a whole range of people who make these decisions. The questions that we are addressing here today, we're having some adventure in Techland today. I guess the reason I'm asking these questions is because, as someone who isn't in government, I'm not privy to whether or not these discussions are taking place and how they're taking place.
They are. I don't want to interrupt you, but of course they are. They are taking place on a regular basis. But I believe what we need in Canada is a much more public debate rather than a closed debate. I think we need to have a much more open discussion about these policy issues, because I think they're critically important. I mean, if you read the headlines, you find out that the government has asked for an assessment as to which technology, which airplanes, which naval equipment and others do we need, and it's an area that's full of lobbying and full of special interests pushing one answer or another. And I just think we need much broader debate and discussion that goes beyond a closed shop in Ottawa,
Can I
or
ask
go
how
shop anywhere else. I think.
can I ask how such a discussion takes place? I'm asking you this as an esteemed Canadian politician who knows the ins and outs of politics. We have turned on a dime from previous assumptions over the course of 10 years. We have NATO that is under attack to its foundational core. We have a relationship with our southern neighbors that is changing drastically. We have a different approach to world trade. We have a rising threat and competitor in Asia. I guess my question is politically, how do we address the multitude of issues and actually find our feet in a world that is changing so rapidly?
Politics is now much more about insulting people. It's much more about attacking people. It's much more about slogans and bumper stickers, and trying to move emotions quickly. It's not about a serious discussion about how do you build up an effective defense capacity for Canada? How do we restructure our economy so that we become a more effective global player? You won't find many of those discussions in the heart of the House of Commons, which is too bad. But that's part of a broader problem about which I wrote about 10 years ago, about how the trivialization of politics and the demeaning of political debate has made these conversations much more difficult.
And so what do you see being the way forward, given the necessity of actually having serious political discussions again at a national level amongst the public? How do we foster that type of engagement if we had it at all in the past?
Well, we did have it at some time. We didn't have as much as we needed then. It's never been easy to get. I think by doing what you and I are doing, which is trying to say, are these issues worth discussing publicly? What do they mean? You asked, should we be learning from Ukraine? Yes, absolutely. Ukraine has a ton to teach countries like Canada about how to build a resilient defense industry. How do you build an industry that can turn quickly, um, and not get into these endless multi-year procurement reviews? I mean, we have developed an incredibly slow, inefficient system, heavily bureaucratic. We're not doing enough to recruit uh, people into the military because we haven't we say it's difficult. Well, then you say it's difficult, then figure out how to do it. Pay people more, part of it. Give people more responsibility when they're younger, part of it. Create a sense that they're working for a dynamic organization that's interested in change and leadership. That's part of it. But also have an engaged and informed discussion that includes obviously the media, the journalistic community, everybody, in having this kind of a debate. And there's a whole range of subjects upon which we need to be better informed and more active. And doing things like having discussions on podcasts is part of what we need to do. There's an explosion of information out there. There's not as much analysis and weighing of the information that's flooding our cell phones these days.
Hmm. Well, one discussion that will definitely be had in Canada is, of course, and this will probably be endless for the rest of time, is the Canada-US relationship. I was reading an article where you were quoted in Politico, where you recently said that reason will prevail in the Canada-US relationship, that it's not in anyone's long-term or even medium-term interest to walk away from a relationship built on rational economics. Um, my question to you is, why are you so confident in that? I've seen Empire. I mean, anyone who studies history, and surely you have, you've taught it to me actually in school. We've seen great powers fall. We've seen great powers fall with
Yeah,
by taking
no,
actions that are.
no, you're right. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, I say things that I hope will happen, not that I'm certain will happen. I say things because I believe they should happen, and because there is a logic to people behaving rationally. But I would be kidding myself and kidding you if I said we're living in a time when the people who are making decisions are all acting in a way that's totally reasonable and rational. I don't think we are living in that kind of an era, And that's what makes it so difficult. That's exactly why we're all walking on eggshells, trying to figure out, well, what's next? No, the destabilization of somebody that you're trying to negotiate with is a well-known, but it's also a tactic that can backfire. And I think we all understand that. It's a bit of a roller coaster at the moment. Do I think it's worth keeping on trying to manage it in a way that's the most beneficial for both sides? I absolutely do. Am I, rock solid certain that that's what's going to happen? No. I do think uh, cooler heads should prevail, and that should be the way it works out. But we all know that doesn't always happen, and that's what makes the time we're living in um, so challenging. It really, we are living in a very challenging moment in history as it relates to ourselves, and more broadly as it relates to beyond the U.S. Canada relationship.
Right. And one of the institutions, of course, that's designed to ease and facilitate that ongoing dialogue is the one that you are a part of right now, the United Nations. Permit me, I used ChatGPT for something. It's one of my first times that I did it. I asked ChatGPT a simple question in anticipation of this interview. I said, if we were to reconstitute a 7-member Security Council today using the same entry criteria that brought about the post-World War II membership, who should be a part of it? And its answer was the US, China, EU and Germany, India, Nigeria, South Africa, Brazil, and Turkey, Saudi Arabia. And that answer is really so far away from what the actual membership looks like today that one has to ask itself, assuming you accept that answer, whether the structure of the UN today is relevant at all. And so I'm going to ask you just directly, because I have this opportunity and you've been incredibly generous with your time, sir. As Canada's permanent representative to the UN, how do you assess the underlying health of the UN as a system of global governance and dialogue, which is the essence of what will, if anything gets us out of the morass, that will. How do you assess the health of the UN, and is the UN facing a lack of credibility that may doom it to irrelevancy? Is there a way of fixing this system? I'd love to hear your thoughts, having spent time in that organization. I would value them.
Well, I mean, the UN is a human institution, which means it's hugely imperfect. It was created in 1945 by 5 victorious countries that decided they needed to have a veto over the future activities of the organization. And we started out with 11 members of the Security Council, not 7. And we then ended up with 15. So the Security Council is too small. It's too small an executive. And the veto is really not helping us. It's not functional. But we wouldn't have a United Nations if we didn't have the veto, because the countries that wanted the veto would not have participated in it. And again, if you have a slightly longer view of history, we did have an experience of failure between 1919 and 1939 with the 20-year history of the League of Nations. And that's part of our history of success and failure. The UN is the one thing you mentioned about, the problems facing the UN. The first problem facing the UN is the biggest members of the world global community don't pay their dues. They don't pay their taxes to the UN on time. And in some cases, they just go on a tax holiday. They say, we're not paying you because we don't like your decisions about X and Y. And so we're not going to pay you. So the most immediate challenge facing the UN is the challenge of money. It's a financial problem. The other problem with the financing of the UN is it doesn't borrow money. And because it doesn't borrow money, it doesn't have the flexibility of every single member state. And the UN is not a global government. It's an association, if you like, of countries who've decided to give it certain jobs to do and certain powers, but it hasn't given it the money to do them, and it hasn't given them the legal authority to actually enforce its own decisions. So, to say the UN is not exactly fit for purpose is an understatement. But that's not a reason to give up. Or, and more precisely, if we had to reinvent an organization because this one collapsed, you would have to do something, because you need a place where countries can meet and talk and engage, and where there can be platforms of discussion and negotiation. And you also need to look beyond the world of conflict and resolution to the world of economic development, to the world of social development, to all of where most of the budget of the UN goes. Most of the budget of the UN goes to health, dealing with disease, malaria, starvation, which is now rearing its head again in many, many parts of the world, dealing with climate change, dealing with the underlying technical issues of globalization like telecommunications. That's where the UN's guts are. That's where its money is. And it, as a global security organization, no, it is not effective. It is not effective. But as I said, it doesn't mean you just throw out the whole thing and say, well, the UN is a waste of money. It's actually, the UN gets far less money than people know and understand. And its main challenge right now, as I said, is not that it has too much money, it's that it doesn't have the financing, the regular assured financing that you'd want any organization to have to be able to do its job.
Yes, perfectly fair. To be clear, by the way, I didn't ask ChatGPT to name 7 members. I asked ChatGPT to name a new council, and it came up with 7 members. But I take what you're
Well,
saying.
that just shows you that just shows you the limits of Chat GPT.
Exactly.
I'm telling you that in all the
Precisely so.
discussions, we have here in New York about how the Security Council and other parts of the UN can be improved. Nobody wants to go back down to 7. That would not work. And you also don't want to make the membership of the Security Council to be frozen in time and not reflective of the changing nature of the global economy. In 1945, China was granted permanent membership in the UN because of its work in because it had been such a strong opponent of Japanese imperialism and the impact of what the Japanese did to not only to China but to the whole of Asia. But they were not there because their economy was great or because they had a very high GDP. Not at all. That's what they were there. And often in history, people make decisions looking backwards and not looking forwards because that's how most people think.
It's interesting. If I had to pick a common thread through the questions and what you've generously provided to us over the 45 minutes of insight, I would tell you it is probably communication. You've brought up communication with the United States. You've brought up communication with our allies. You've brought up communication at the organization of the UN. And it seems like communication is perhaps the aspect that is sorely lacking presently from the oil of the international system. It's given me quite a bit to think about, and I appreciate those insights very much. I'm looking forward to reviewing this video and listening again to those contributions. Sir, I'm incredibly grateful for your time. I've promised a 45-minute interview, and we're approaching the end. But is there anything that you would say to an audience interested in international relations, international economics, that will vest them with a hopeful future? There's a lot of bad news out there. There's a lot of challenges. But I always find that the world has a bright spot too. Based on your career, your illustrious long career, what positive note would you want to leave for Canadians who are listening to the show about the international system and about ways that they can see a brighter future ahead?
Well, the first one is we have no real alternative but to think more globally and to think more internationally about what's going on in our own lives and what really matters. Um, it just is. It's just the way it is. We cannot retreat into ourselves. We have to continue to look outwards because there's just so much. There's so much there, and it has so much impact on everything that happens to us. The second thing is this question of communication, and that is a good part of communication is not just talking, but a good part of communication is also listening. We give a lot of courses on public speaking. We don't give very many courses on intensive listening. And I think when we talk about communication, we need to remember the famous saying of George Bernard Shaw, is that the biggest mistake we make in thinking about communication is believing that it's already happened. We always start with assumptions about what other people know and what other people are thinking and feeling. And we're often amazed when you say, well, didn't you know that? Or didn't I tell you that? Or weren't you aware of that? And you don't get there without effectively communicating and also effectively listening to what other people are saying. And the last thing I'd say is that if you don't create the space in your life for optimism, you get overwhelmed by pessimism. And then pessimism drives out any potential for creative thinking. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in other people's lives. People can't think of options because they're too pessimistic. They're too defeated. They've defeated themselves. And so this is really why it is so important to think in a context of how can we make things better? How can we improve things? And there is no perfect answer, but there are some answers, and it's important to keep trying to find them. And that, I think, is the spirit that we should all embrace. Think globally, learn how to listen, and really, really learn how to think positively about what you can do and how you, as an individual, can contribute to making the world a better place.
I think that's an ideal place to end this podcast. Those are good messages. Those are solid action plans. And quite frankly, I think that is probably the best advice those people who are starting out their careers can ingest. And if nothing else, I hope that they take that back with them for many years. So, Ambassador Ray, I want to thank you sincerely for your time. You've been most generous. I know we've had some technical issues throughout this, but as I said at the outset, the content is there, and the content is what matters. Thank you for doing what you've done throughout your career. Thank you for being our ambassador. Thank you for being our premier. Thank you for being my MP. It's had a huge effect for myself and others, and I'm grateful that we have had this time together. I will remember it for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, and happy editing.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Please hit that like, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single second of